So, as Anne pointed out, this paper is called with my Monash University colleague Louisa Willoughby, who is a linguist, with whom I've been working for now 3 or 4 years, since shortly after joining Monash University at the end of 2017. So the paper really aims to address what we think, or at least I think, is a significant gap in the political theory literature, both in democratic theory and in the linguistic justice literature, which is a lack of emphasis, a lack of focus on linguistic prejudice. Obviously, linguistic prejudice is widely studied in linguistics, but even though many democratic theories, for example, are committed to deliberative conception, a model of democracy, quite surprisingly, issues of intra-linguistic diversity, which is what we focus on in this paper, so issues concerning prejudice based on the way in which different people speak the same language when communicated, are often overlooked in this literature. And this is just a poster from, a propaganda poster from the First World War in the US. Now, one of the many examples that you can find of linguistic prejudice in the history of the US, but also there are many in Australia and the UK elsewhere. If you just look at the Anglosphere, of course, linguistic prejudice occurs in every language, in any context in which there's a lingua franca that people speak, in which they communicate in social and political life. Now, so I said that there's a sort of gap in the literature in political theory, but what's the gap? What are the gaps? Now, there's a body of work called the linguistic justice literature, most of you, I'm sure are familiar with, which over the past 20 years or so has started to look at the normative dimensions of language policy, basically answering the question, what's the just management by the state of linguistic diversity? Should minority languages be protected? Should the state promote a lingua franca through which people can communicate, participate in economic, social, and political life, and so on? But in this body of literature, there's very little, if any, focus on intra-linguistic justice and injustice. So on the question of what happens when people do converge towards a lingua franca, but they speak this lingua franca in different ways with different accents, registers, and for this reason, some of them may be excluded from key sites of social and political life. There's very little on this. Conversely, in political science, in empirical political science, there is a growing body of work on linguistic prejudice, including in the democratic political context. So scholars have been looking at the effect of candidates' voice pitch or vocal attractiveness or accent on their electability. But the thing is that this is a very empirical literature. It doesn't ask normative questions about the implications of linguistic prejudice. So we address these two gaps in this paper. We try to address these two gaps by combining political theory and sociolinguistics to develop a normative but empirically informed argument about linguistic prejudice. But the problem that we address is not just the gap that we find in these two bodies of literature. There's also there seem to be assumptions in the literature regarding the fact that linguistic prejudice, and especially intralinguistic diversity, is perhaps not an issue. John Elster, for example, argues in one of his works that in electoral context, we can reduce people's voters' bias by basically broadcasting electoral debates on the radio in order to remove any distortion, any bias that visual expressions can cause. But this is to assume the oral expressions, so the sound of people's voice, the way in which people speak, the way in which candidates speak, doesn't matter. But of course it does matter, as empirical science shows us. So that's something that we should normatively consider. Also, the vast majority of those working in linguistic justice, some of whom also work on democratic theory, they really seem to assume that when it comes to democratic politics, the best way to go is to converge towards a lingua franca. Now, these are scholars like Alan Patten, others, even Will Kimligan makes a similar argument. These are scholars who have defended in various ways, based on different rationales, various forms of minority language rights, for example. But when it comes to democratic politics, they all seem to converge towards the idea that, well, it's better to have one shared language of democratic life, to deliberate in public life using that language, because having too many languages is confusing, it's disruptive, that's not the way to go. But again, this assumption, which is not really based on much empirical evidence, overlooks intralinguistic prejudice. It overlooks the fact that even if we do share a lingua franca, we are not going to speak the lingua franca in the same way. People will differ in the way they speak the language, whatever the language is, English or any other language. So we see that there are lots of gaps here, and we address these gaps by looking specifically at linguistic prejudice in the context of a specific aspect of democratic life, which is electoral discrimination. So we don't look in this specific paper at democratic life in general, the way in which citizens participate in democratic deliberation, but we look at political representatives and the potential implications that linguistic prejudice might have for them as candidates in elections. The question we ask is it permissible for citizens to discriminate against certain political candidates because of the way they speak? No, we know that electors not discriminate routinely against candidates based on the race, ethnicity, other features, gender, but what we focus here is their way of speaking. And to do so, to address this question, we draw on what seems to be really the only, as far as we know, the only normative account of electoral discrimination in political theory. I know the other scholars are working on this, but the work is not published yet. So this seems to be the only published piece that tackles this question of electoral discrimination, which is a piece by Andrew Rehfeld, whose work most of you will be familiar with, especially his work on political representation. But in this specific paper, he focuses on electoral discrimination, and he makes a distinction between two kinds of what he calls qualifications for office. Now, qualifications for office, according to Rehfeld, are, quote, rules or circumstances that have the effect of differentially distributing probabilities of success to candidates for office. He argues that we can distinguish between two kinds of qualifications: voter exogenous, so institutional measures, like quota, secure seats, that affect the results of elections, end up discriminating against certain candidates. He finds these voter exogenous qualifications undemocratic, contrary to the spirit of democracy. On the other hand, he says there are voter endogenous qualifications. So people, voters, exercise their judgment when decided for which candidates to vote for. And that kind of judgment will, of course, result in discrimination between different candidates. But he argues that that's democratic, that's compatible with democracy. He argues that that's the case because in a democracy, we really need to have a commitment. When a modern conception of democracy involves a commitment to a number of key normative principles. One is the right of voters to choose between candidates. That's what voter endogenous qualifications refer to. So each of us should have a right to use our judgment to make whichever decision we want regarding which candidates we want to vote for. A right to run for office, so the right of people to potentially become political representatives, but there's no a right to serve in office, something that perhaps belongs to an ancient conception of democracy, but not to a modern one. So if we focus on those two rights, the right to choose among candidates and the right to run for office, that is what, according to Rehfeld, justifies the fact that people can use their judgment and make decisions about the preferred candidates based on whichever principles they want to. That is not democratic for them to do so. Now, we find two problems with Rehfeld's argument. The first is the use of qualifications. This term they uses to identify this sort of factors that may affect the chances of candidates being elected. It's a confusing term because when we think about qualifications, when we think about skills, things like that. So to avoid any confusion, we replace in this paper with the term constraints. So what we think Rehfeld is really talking about in voter endogenous and voter exogenous constraints, which may affect in different ways candidates' likelihood of being elected. The second point, which is the more important point that we make, a critical point about Rehfeld's argument, is that it seems to be based on a very simplistic view of voter endogenous constraints. So it seems that for him, any voter judgment, any kind of voter judgment that voters use to choose between candidates and to limit some candidates' probability of being elected is fine, is acceptable, no matter how the voters reach that judgment, through which process, based on which information. And we think that this is inherently problematic. Why? Well, we think so because we don't accept the idea that any form of voter judgment should be equally acceptable in a democracy. No, voters should make decisions about which candidates they want to vote for or which parties, in other cases, competently, in good faith. Now, Jason Brennan has made this point. He defended conception of epistocracy. We don't go down that route, so we don't follow him all the way, but we share with him and with other scholars the idea that voters in a democracy should at least make a genuine attempt to be informed and competent when making decisions, and not only when they participate directly in democratic life, but also when they choose between parties and between, in this case, political candidates. And we think that, therefore, when voter judgment is incompetent and biased, including now when it's driven by linguistic prejudice, that's problematic. That's a kind of voter endogenous constraint which really is undemocratic. It's not compatible with the equal right to run for office in a way that is compatible with the modern idea of democracy that I outlined earlier. So it undermines political equality because, it's fine for people to choose between different candidates because they endorse one candidate's ideological views rather than another candidate's. That's fine, and that's not often normally the result of rational judgment. But it's not fine when voters judge candidates simply because they're driven by some kind of prejudice, which is grounded in their perception of that candidate, of those candidates' linguistic abilities or accent or register and so on. And the additional problem when it comes to linguistic prejudice specifically is that it's particularly insidious. It's particularly dangerous because it's a kind of prejudice of which most people are unaware of. This is what a lot of research in linguistics shows. And therefore, not recognizing this prejudice, not addressing it, is particularly problematic for democratic life and for political equality. If people are driven, if voters are driven by linguistic, unconscious linguistic prejudice when choosing between candidates, that undermines candidates' equal right to run for office in a way which is not consistent with the modern conception of democracy and political equality. So in the paper, we use a couple of scenarios or examples to show what kind of voter judgment or voter endogenous constraint, to use Rehfeld's term, is acceptable and what is not, based on our view. So again, if someone decides not to vote for a communist candidate, a political candidate who endorses communist views because they simply don't believe in communist ideals, communist ideology, they may be libertarians or liberal or whatever, if this decision is based on awareness and understanding of what communism involves and what alternative ideologies involves, this is fine. This is not a central element of democracy. It's absolutely fine for candidates, a communist candidate, to have fewer chances to be elected if this is the result of voter judgment based on awareness and understanding of their ideology. But things are different if a candidate's likelihood to be elected or non-elected is affected by the linguistic prejudice that drives voters. And one example, we don't discuss this in the paper, but it's a recent one. Angela Rayner, who's the deputy leader of the UK Labour Party, has been criticised several times for speaking in Parliament with a working class accent. And if and when voters are driven driven to vote against or not to choose, not to vote for candidates like Rayner because of this kind of bias against working class accents or any other type of accent which is not considered positive or as having positive connotations, we think that undermines the idea of democratic political equality. Now, the important thing is that those kind of scenarios are often combined in the real world. So it's often the case that voters, of course, have certain views about candidates' ideology, policy platform, and so on, policy preferences, and they may also be driven at the same time by linguistic prejudice. And in a sense, the linguistic prejudice may color the way in which they understand and also judge the candidates' views. So it's important to remember that in the real world, we cannot not keep the two things separate. But our point is that the more unconscious linguistic prejudice plays a role in voters' decisions about candidates, the more this is in tension with the modern ideal of political equality. Now, it's also important to stress that we are not arguing here that candidates who are targets of linguistic prejudice, they're not going to have any chances to have a successful political career. Many of the politicians, all the politicians that I will discuss later in the second part of the paper, Australian politicians have had a successful career, and Rayner is having a good political career in the UK. But the point is that these candidates often have to make an extra effort not to be electable. Because of the prejudice, the linguistic prejudice that they encounter, they're likely to find it more difficult to be elected and to present themselves as legitimate political representatives to the people, to the voters. And we think that in itself, even though it might not prevent entirely the political careers, it's an obstacle in the way that it's not consistent with democratic political equality. Now, so that's the normative argument. So what can we learn from sociolinguistics? In which way can sociolinguistics enrich, or research from sociolinguistics enrich our understanding of linguistic prejudice, and therefore help reinforce, empirically reinforce this argument? Now, the research in sociolinguistics, research on linguistic prejudice normally is based, revolves around what they call subjective reaction tests, which are also called match guys tests. So basically, these are experiments in which participants are asked to listen to recordings of different speakers with different accents and to assign ratings to them, to each speaker based on certain characteristics. So do you find the speaker sincere, credible, competent, educated, kind, and so on? What do you think the social status is, and so on? And the research really systematically provides consistent results. It shows that people have consistent judgments about the way in which people speak. So normally people who speak with socially prestigious accents like received pronunciation in the UK are considered more competent, sometimes more intelligent than others, but also at the same time less friendly. So there's always a downside as well. And also, those who speak with ethnically marked varieties of English or with a foreign accent are normally considered less competent than those who instead speak with a sort of native, so to speak, accent. That may affect their chances in job, educational context, and so on. And in the political context, as the body of empirical political science literature that I mentioned earlier shows, this can affect also their chances of being elected, their chances as political candidates. Another thing that sociolinguistics research on linguistic prejudice shows is that this kind of prejudice is very much entrenched because it's formed very early in people's life. And therefore it's difficult for people to really move away from it in later years. Also, a broader implication of the widespread presence of linguistic prejudice in every society is that normally candidates from minority backgrounds including politicians, may go through some sort of accent reduction training in order to reduce their accent, whatever that might be, because it may be a non-desirable, an accent which is not considered non-desirable because it's a specific regional, class, or ethnic minority accent. And they try therefore to acquire proficiency in whichever is considered the standard or prestigious variety of the language. But the problem is that when people try to do so, and this applies to politicians but also to citizens more generally, the problem is that it may be considered as non-genuine, as natural. So that in a sense there's no solution for people in this situation, because if they speak with a non-prestigious accent, an accent considered non-prestigious, they are targets of prejudice. But if they try to address that issue by undergoing training, they are also not accepted because that's not their natural way of speaking, so to speak. So it's a loss-loss situation for them. Other things that we can learn from sociolinguistics is that when people listen to other people, when individuals listen to other people speaking, and something unusual emerges in the way these other people speak, in their accent, and the vocabulary sometimes, in the way they speak, in the register, that triggers what linguists call a sort of interpretive overdrive. So people, listener, will start to make a sort of a series of complex assumptions about who the person is, their identity, their skills, their qualities, and all these judgments are often very fallible. They're rarely grounded in any empirical evidence. So if someone speaks with a working class accent, and many people judge that person as non-competent, non-intelligent, obviously there's no objective connection between those two things, but socially there's a connection which is entrenched in people's minds, which is triggered anytime people are exposed to those accents. It's something that, as I said, is formed early in life. Unless addressed early on, it's difficult to get rid of. In the case of those candidates, political candidates who are multiply minoritized, so people who are from an ethnic minority background, gender minority background, linguistic minority background, the interpretative overdrive is likely to be more complex and more serious because all these different aspects of their identity intersect, so to speak. And finally, this is what linguists call the vampire effect of foreign accents. This occurs when listeners start to focus mainly or solely on the speaker's accent, and therefore they don't even pay attention to what the speaker is saying. And that's problematic because epistemically the listener is missing out on key information which could be relevant to elections in the political context, but to any other context, in the job environment, in the educational environment. Imagine a student listening to a lecture and focusing on the accent and missing out key information about the content of the lecture. So that's problematic. It's something that linguists have shown to occur more very often in different contexts. Of course, all of this doesn't mean that speaking with a sort of less prestigious accent is always has negative consequences for politicians. There can be political candidates who are capable and willing to exploit the accent and register the way of speaking they have. So in that case, they may, for example, a candidate might want to come across as an everyday real person, not a politician, speaking an accent which is considered less prestigious, less posh, less upper class, may be very attractive for some of their constituents and therefore politically useful for them. But in general, the key point is that those candidates who don't speak with whichever is the local white male language norms, and accent and variety of speaking are likely to pay a price for that. So just to conclude with a few examples from Australia, in the final part of the paper, we do focus on some politicians, prominent politicians from Australia. We focus on Australia because that's where we are working, but also because Australia is a deeply multilingual, multicultural society, also because there are distinctive institutional features in Australia which facilitate political participation. Alongside compulsory voting, different aspects of electoral design in Australia imply that representative democracy, even without considering more participatory forms of democracy, but representative democracy itself is somehow more inclusive than many other liberal democracies where the electoral system or the lack of compulsory voting may fail to fully include all citizens in decision making by other representatives. So the point is that if linguistic prejudice is a source of exclusion in Australia, it's likely to also be a source of exclusion, even more so in other countries in which there are not all these positive conditions that facilitate participation by a diverse range of citizens and political candidates. So some example. First one is Gladys Liu, who was a former Liberal Party representative for Chisholm in Victoria. She was the first ethnically Chinese woman to be elected to the House of Representatives, and some of you might know she's been routinely the target of negative commentary, linguistic prejudice because of her accent, basically, and often those criticisms have been linked with a more general attacks of which she's been victim concerning her alleged lack of loyalty to Australia. So many people argue that because of her Chinese background, she was not truly affiliated to Australia, loyal to Australia, and her way of speaking was used as an additional argument to fit this story, this narrative that she's not really one of us, so to speak. Obviously, I disagree with all these views. I'm just reporting what many people's views about Gladys Liu were and are in Australia. Second example, Matthias Cormann, former finance minister, Belgian-born German-speaking, native German speaker. The interesting thing about Matthias Korman is that, yes, it speaks with an accent, and this was often noted, highlighted, not when he was in a prominent political role. But the thing to remember, that one other thing that we learn from sociolinguistics is that not all accents are equal, of course. Hierarchies of prejudice also occur between, for example, different foreign accents when we are talking about English. So when English is the lingua franca of political communication, democratic life, not all foreign accents will be assigned the same prestige or lack of prestige. So in this sense, European accents are normally assigned greater prestige in Australia and other Anglophone countries than non-European accents. And Korman, in a sense, benefited from this because his German accent was not really, according to some, disadvantage for him, but something that he could actually use, exploit, leverage to build this public image of the technocrat who's good at managing the economy. So the accent, his German accent, to fit with this persona, with this understanding, self-understanding that Korman had and the people had about Korman as a technocrat, an efficient technocrat, good at his job. Another example, Jackie Lambie, Tasmanian senator, who's being criticized often, quote, for being stupid, or bogan for speaking with a broad Australian accent. The interesting thing is that there's a gender dimension to this as well, because similar criticism have been raised against Julia Gillard, former prime minister and Labour leader. And the interesting is that while Lambie and Julia Gillard have been criticized for this, former Australian Prime Minister Bob Hawke was praised for his broad Australian accent. So you can see that language often intersects with other elements of people's identity, so that women are more likely to be judged negatively, harshly, for using a non-standard language form than men in a similar situation. So you can see the intersectionality is obviously a clear element in this.
There's a couple of minutes left.
Yeah. Thank you. And the other point in the case of Julia Gillard is that by speaking this way, she was also criticized because that kind of accent that she used was considered non-natural for someone who was born in Wales, the UK, and grew up in Adelaide. So that sort of also a mismatch, an alleged mismatch between whichever way of speaking listeners expect a politician to have, and the way in which she or he actually speaks. Similar case, Christina Keneally, former Prime Minister of New South Wales, LP senator, former LP senator, who is US born. And she's also been often criticized for sounding too American, but then when she underwent training to learn to speak more Australian, she was criticized for doing so. And this goes back to the example, the situation that I illustrated earlier.
The camera's gone out.
Yeah.
Sorry, I've cut everyone off mid-sentence.
It's nearly finished, but yeah, thank you. So that's the situation in which certain politicians, they cannot win. They damn if they do something, they try to learn a new way of speaking, but also damn if they don't. If they continue to speak with whichever less prestigious variety of a language they normally use. So in conclusion, our argument is that political candidates whose language variety deviates from white male standard norms, and again, this applies to English, but it can apply to any language, depending on the context, are likely to encounter a number of negative evaluations to be targets of linguistic prejudice as a result. And therefore, they might still be able to have a successful political career, like also the politicians have just referred to, but they will struggle to do so. And this struggling, the obstacles that they encounter because of this linguistic prejudice are something that is not fully compatible with a modern conception of democracy and political equality. It's an undemocratic constraint on the right to run for office, which is not compatible with modern democratic ideals. Thank you very much. I look forward to questions and comments. Thank you.